New Year's Eve fell on a Monday in 1888, and as the country as a whole prepared to ring in 1889, the people of London found themselves enveloped in a thick fog. The Globe described the state of the streets in its edition of that evening. The metropolis was this morning visited by the thickest and most trying fog experienced during the present season. It settled down early in the morning and was accompanied by a very sharp frost. The fog appears to extend to all London suburbs for a considerable distance, and, of course, it has caused considerable inconvenience. At one time during the forenoon there was a slight clearance, and there seemed a probability of a fine afternoon. But by about 11 the fog came down again, blacker and darker than ever, and so continued until after 2 o'clock, when it gradually cleared. The Sunderland Daily Echo looked forward to the festivities that would see the old year out and the new year in. Yet a few hours, and in thousands of churches and chapels, people will bow their heads in silent prayer during the few moments which mark the death of the old year and the birth of the new. Then thousands of steeples' bells will ring merrily, and millions of hands will grasp hands with hearty wishes of health and prosperity during 1889. The first foot will be received in numberless houses with acclamation, and mirth and youthful jollity will prevail into the small hours of the morning. There are no homes like British homes for these social, I beg pardon of literary purists, fraternalia. Gentle sleep will put a partition, in many cases a very thin partition, between these social revels and the festivities of the new-born year. Well, I shall be present in sympathy at all such revels wisely conducted, and wish all a happy new year. However, many people across the land were looking forward to the coming new year with feelings of dreadful foreboding. 2 child murders that had taken place in the closing months of 1888 were being widely reported in the press, and many newspapers were attributing the crimes to Jack the Ripper. On the 26th of November, the body of 8-year-old Percy Knight Searle had been found in the Havant district of Portsmouth, and on the 27th of December, 7-year-old John Gill had been murdered in Bradford, in the north of England. Although the police and the more responsible elements of the media were adamant that neither crime was linked to the Whitechapel murderer, the extensive press coverage given to the 2 murders had led to a resurgence of the trepidation that had gripped the country over the autumn, and this, coupled with the fact that Jack the Ripper was still at large, meant that many people were looking forward to the coming new year with feelings of dreadful foreboding, convinced that the country was in the grip of a sort of murder mania. The Sheffield Daily Telegraph took up this theme in its New Year's Eve edition. The new year will open with every prospect of being a happy one for the English people, who are now reaping the fruits of honest, firm and resolute government on the part of those whom they have entrusted with the management of their affairs. The only subject which causes any anxiety is that of the repeated outbreak of the fiendish form of crime which had its birth in Whitechapel. The Metropolitan Police are, of course, in close touch with the provincial police, but hitherto all their efforts to detect the criminal have come to naught. The latest phase of this epidemic is the most distressing and appalling of all, for whereas in the former cases the victims lent themselves to the purposes of their slaughter, in the latter cases the victims have been innocent, unsuspecting, defenceless children. The Havant and Yorkshire crimes are regarded by the police here as probably the work of some cowardly and cunning lunatic of the Silly Billy order, and I understand that cautions have been distributed as to the movements of persons of that class who are to be found in almost every village throughout the country. The lunacy laws have gathered into safe-keeping thousands of brainless wretches who used to wander about the roads and lanes of the country, but there are still a good many who have not been considered bad enough for the asylums, and who, from the very fact of their possessing more or less intelligence, are peculiarly liable to have their insane tendencies developed by hearing or reading of the East London crimes. I was talking the other day with an eminent psychologist who told me that in his opinion we are seeing the beginning of a mania which, unless it can be checked, may reach frightful proportions. He considers that there are probably hundreds of people in our midst whose minds are hovering on the verge of insanity, though nobody suspects it, and are liable at any moment to be thrown off their mental balance by the recurrence of these mysterious horrors, which case their mania would almost certainly take a homicidal turn. The detection and execution of even one of the murderers would, he considers, be the best check, not so much by bringing home the consequences of discovery as by dissipating the unwholesome atmosphere of mystery which has gathered round these crimes and which has a fatal fascination for morbid minds. Of course, the Jack the Ripper atrocities were still forefront in most minds, and the killer's whereabouts were the subject of a large amount of discussion in the newspapers. The Pall Mall Gazette, in its New Year's Eve edition, carried news that the hunt for the perpetrator had apparently moved to the other side of the Atlantic. Inspector Andrews of Scotland Yard has arrived in New York from Montreal. It is generally believed that he has received orders from England to commence his search in this city for the Whitechapel murderer. Mr. Andrews is reported to have said that there are half a dozen English detectives, 2 clerks and 1 inspector, employed in America in the same chase. He has received orders which will keep him in America for some time. The supposed inaction of the Whitechapel murderer for a considerable period, and the fact that a man suspected of knowing a good deal about this series of crimes left England for this side of the Atlantic 3 weeks ago, has, says the Telegraph correspondent, produced the impression that Jack the Ripper is in that country. The same edition of the Pall Mall Gazette reprinted an article from the Sunday Times which spoke of a certain suspect who was under surveillance. According to the Sunday Times, a gentleman who has for some time been engaged in philanthropic work in the East End of London recently received a letter, the handwriting of which had previously attracted the attention of the post office authorities on account of its similarity to that of the writer of some of the letters signed Jack the Ripper. The police made inquiries and ascertained that the writer was known to his correspondent as a person intimately acquainted with East End life, and that he was then a patient in a metropolitan hospital. It is stated that on an inquiry at the hospital it was discovered that the person sought had left without the consent or knowledge of the hospital authorities, but that he has been subsequently seen and is now under observation. The police are of the opinion that the last 5 murders were a series and that the first 2 were independently perpetrated. As the old year ebbed towards its final moments, the Pall Mall Gazette turned its attention back to the weather and informed its readers of the effect the fog was having on the physical and mental health of Londoners. The mild weather of Christmas being succeeded by a slight frost, we are closing the year under a dismal fog of a quite incalculable capability for adding to human wretchedness. It is a miserable, murky fog, which it is a punishment to breathe, and through which it is difficult to see, although, to do it justice, it is whiter than most London fogs of the evil kind. But what it lacks in villainy of appearance, it more than makes up for in infamy of its effect on the nerves and the lungs. And thus 1888 closed with a combination of fog and fear, as people across the land held their collective breaths and awaited whatever fresh horrors the new year might have in store. Happy New Year, everybody.